It was a quiet evening, the kind that made him feel at peace with the world. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the small suburban home he had shared with his wife for over 4 decades. He sat in his favorite armchair, a book resting on his lap, though he hadn't turned a page in over an hour. Retirement had given him the luxury of time, and he often found himself lost in thought, reminiscing about the adventures of his youth. His wife was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. The sound was comforting, a familiar melody that had been the soundtrack of their life together. They had built a good life, 2 children, now grown and successful, and a handful of grandchildren who brought them endless joy. By all accounts, they were the picture of a happy, contented couple. But that evening, as he rummaged through an old desk in the study, something caught his eye. Tucked away in the back of a drawer, beneath a stack of faded photographs and forgotten documents, was a letter. The envelope was yellowed with age, the edges frayed. His name was written on the front in his wife's handwriting, but it had never been opened. Curiosity got the better of him. He carefully opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. As he began to read, his heart started to race. The words on the page were like a punch to the gut, each sentence unraveling a secret he had never imagined. The letter was a confession. His wife had written it years ago, during a time when their marriage had hit a rough patch. She spoke of loneliness, of feeling unseen and unappreciated. And then, she revealed the unthinkable, a brief affair with a man he had once called a friend. The room seemed to spin as he read the words over and over, trying to make sense of them. How could this be? How could the woman he had loved and trusted for so many years have kept something like this from him? He sat there, the letter clutched in his hands, his mind racing with questions. Why had she never given him the letter? Why had she chosen to keep this secret buried for so long? And what did it mean for their life together now? The sound of his wife's voice calling him to dinner broke the silence, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. He felt a mix of emotions, anger, betrayal, confusion, and a deep, aching sadness. As he sat there, staring at the letter, he realized that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The calm he had felt just moments ago was gone, replaced by a storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. What happened next would leave him speechless. The husband sat frozen in his chair, the letter still trembling in his hands. His wife's voice called out again, this time closer, and he quickly folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. He wasn't ready to face her, not yet. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more painful than the last. How could she have done this? How could she have kept such a secret from him for so many years? When she appeared in the doorway, her smile faded as soon as she saw his face. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. He hesitated, unsure of how to begin. Part of him wanted to shout, to demand answers, but another part of him was afraid of what those answers might mean. Finally, he reached into his pocket and handed her the letter without a word. Her face turned pale as she recognized the envelope. She didn't need to open it to know what it contained. For a long moment, she just stood there, staring at it, her hands shaking. Then, slowly, she sat down in the chair across from him, her eyes filled with tears. "I never meant for you to find this," she said softly, her voice breaking. "But I did," he replied, his tone sharper than he intended. "How long were you going to keep this from me? Were you ever going to tell me?" She looked down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. "I wrote that letter years ago, during a time when I was lost and confused. I wanted to tell you, but I was too afraid. I thought it would destroy us, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing you." Her words cut through him like a knife. "So instead, you let me live a lie?" he asked, his voice rising. "All these years, I thought we had something real, something unbreakable. But now, I don't know what to think." She reached out to touch his hand, but he pulled away. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Let me explain. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about us, about everything we weren't saying to each other back then." He wanted to walk away, to shut her out, but something in her voice stopped him. Despite the anger and betrayal he felt, he couldn't ignore the pain in her eyes. Reluctantly, he nodded for her to continue. She took a deep breath and began to tell him about that time in their lives, a period he had tried to forget. They had been drifting apart, caught up in the demands of work and raising their children. They had stopped talking, stopped connecting, and she had felt more alone than ever. "I didn't plan for it to happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was just one moment of weakness, one mistake that I've regretted every day since. I ended it almost immediately, but I couldn't bring myself to tell you. I was so ashamed." He listened in silence, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to forgive her, to believe that it was just a mistake. But another part of him couldn't let go of the betrayal, the thought that she had shared something so intimate with someone else. "Who was it?" he asked finally, his voice cold. She hesitated, then whispered the name of a man he had once considered a close friend. The revelation hit him like a second blow. This wasn't just a stranger, it was someone he had trusted, someone who had been a part of their lives. "I need some time to think," he said, standing up abruptly. He couldn't be in the same room with her, not right now. She nodded, her face filled with sorrow. "I understand," she said quietly. "But please know that I love you, and I always have. I made a terrible mistake, but it doesn't change how much you mean to me." He didn't respond. Instead, he walked out of the room, his mind racing. He needed answers, but he wasn't sure where to start. That night, he made a decision. He would dig deeper into the past, no matter how painful it might be. He needed to understand what had really happened, not just for closure, but to decide if their marriage could survive. The next morning, he began reaching out to old friends and family members, carefully probing for information. Each conversation revealed a little more, painting a picture of a time he had tried to forget. Slowly, he began to piece together the story, but with each new detail, the pain only grew. By the end of the week, he had learned enough to confront the man his wife had the affair with. It was a meeting he dreaded, but he knew he couldn't move forward without it. As he drove to the small town where the man now lived, his mind was a storm of emotions. Anger, sadness, confusion, they all swirled together, making it hard to think clearly. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to stop until he had the whole truth. The part ends with the husband pulling up to a modest house, his heart pounding as he prepared to face the man who had played a role in shattering his world. The house was small and unassuming, tucked away on a quiet street lined with old trees. The husband sat in his car for a moment, staring at the front door, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His heart was racing, and his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. He didn't know what to expect from this meeting, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and walked up the narrow path to the front door. The man who answered was older now, his hair gray and his face lined with age, but there was no mistaking him. It was the same man he had once called a friend, the same man who had betrayed him in the worst possible way. For a moment, they just stood there, staring at each other in silence. Then, the man nodded and stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. The house was modest but cozy, filled with the kind of clutter that comes from a life well lived. The husband followed the man into the living room, where they sat down across from each other. The air between them was heavy with tension, and neither of them seemed to know how to begin. Finally, the husband broke the silence. "I think you know why I'm here," he said, his voice steady but cold. The man nodded, his expression somber. "I do," he replied. "And I've been expecting this for a long time." The husband's eyes narrowed. "Then you know how much pain you've caused. Not just to me, but to my wife, to our family. How could you do it? How could you betray me like that?" The man sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't expect you to believe me, but I want you to know that I've regretted it every single day since it happened. It was a mistake, a terrible, selfish mistake, and I've spent years trying to make amends." "Make amends," the husband repeated, his voice rising. "How do you make amends for something like that? You destroyed my trust, my marriage, my life." The man flinched but didn't look away. I know, he said quietly. And I can't undo what I did. But I can tell you the truth, if you're willing to hear it. The husband hesitated, then nodded. Go on. The man took a deep breath and began to speak. He told the husband about that time in their lives, a time when everything had seemed to be falling apart. The husband had been distant, consumed by work and other responsibilities, and his wife had felt neglected and alone. I was going through my own struggles, the man explained. My marriage had ended, and I was lost. Your wife and I, we leaned on each other in a way we shouldn't have. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't something either of us wanted to happen. But it did, and we both knew it was wrong. The husband listened in silence, his anger slowly giving way to a deep, aching sadness. He had always thought of the affair as a betrayal, but now he was starting to see it as something more complicated, a symptom of the cracks that had already been forming in his marriage. I ended it almost immediately, the man continued. I knew it was a mistake, and I couldn't live with the guilt. I tried to distance myself from both of you, but the guilt never went away. I've spent years trying to make up for what I did, even if it was in small ways. I donated to charities, volunteered, did whatever I could to try to balance the scales. But I know it's not enough. The husband sat back, his mind reeling. He had come here looking for answers, but he hadn't expected to hear this. He had always thought of the affair as a black and white issue, a clear-cut betrayal. But now he was starting to see the shades of gray, the complexities that had led to that moment. Why didn't you tell me? He asked finally, his voice softer now. The man shook his head. I wanted to, but I was too much of a coward. I was afraid of what it would do to you, to your family. I thought it was better to keep it buried, to let you live in ignorance. But I see now that I was wrong. Secrets have a way of coming out, no matter how hard you try to hide them. The husband nodded, his anger now replaced by a deep sense of exhaustion. He had spent the past few weeks consumed by rage and betrayal, but now he felt something else, understanding. He still didn't know if he could forgive the man sitting across from him, but he could see that the affair wasn't just about betrayal. It was about pain, loneliness, and the mistakes people make when they're lost. I don't know if I can forgive you, he said finally. But I think I understand. The man nodded, his eyes filled with regret. I don't expect forgiveness, he said quietly. But I hope you can find a way to move forward, for your sake and for your wife's. She loves you, and she always has. Don't let this destroy what you built together. The husband stood up, feeling a strange mix of emotions. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain, he couldn't keep living in the past. As he walked out of the house and back to his car, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in weeks. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it. The drive home was quiet, the hum of the car's engine the only sound breaking the silence. The husband's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one pulling him in a different direction. He had gone to confront the man who had betrayed him, expecting to find answers that would either fuel his anger or give him closure. Instead, he had found something far more complicated, a story of pain, regret, and human frailty. As he pulled into the driveway of his home, he saw his wife sitting on the porch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up as he approached, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. She had been waiting for him, and he could see the toll the past few weeks had taken on her. For a moment, they just stood there, staring at each other. Then, she spoke, her voice trembling. I'm so sorry, she said, tears streaming down her face. I never wanted to hurt you. I love you, and I always have. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he sat down beside her, his mind still processing everything he had learned. The anger he had felt earlier was still there, but it was no longer the all-consuming fire it had been. In its place was a deep, aching sadness, a sadness for the pain they had both endured, for the years they had lost to silence and misunderstanding. I talked to him, he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. She nodded, her eyes filled with guilt. I figured you would, she replied. What did he say? He took a deep breath and began to tell her about the conversation, about the man's regrets and the pain he had carried for so many years. As he spoke, he watched her face, searching for any sign of deception or insincerity. But all he saw was sorrow and remorse. When he finished, she reached out and took his hand, her touch tentative but warm. "I know I can't undo what I did," she said softly. "But I want you to know that I've regretted it every single day since it happened. I was lost and lonely, and I made a terrible mistake. But it doesn't change how much I love you, how much I've always loved you." He looked down at their hands, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to pull away, to hold on to the anger and betrayal. But another part of him, a deeper, quieter part, wanted to forgive her, to find a way to move forward. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said finally, his voice breaking. "But I want to try. I don't want to lose what we have, not after all these years." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand," she said. "And I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust again. I just need you to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." They sat there for a long time, the silence between them filled with unspoken words and emotions. It wasn't easy, and it wouldn't be easy for a long time. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope, a hope that they could find a way to heal, to rebuild what had been broken. Over the next few weeks, they began to take small steps toward reconciliation. They started talking again, really talking, about the things they had kept buried for so long. They shared their regrets, their fears, and their hopes for the future. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments when the pain and anger threatened to overwhelm them. But they kept going, determined to find a way forward. They also decided to seek counseling, to work through the issues that had led to the affair and to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. It was a difficult process, but it gave them the tools they needed to communicate openly and honestly. Slowly, they began to reconnect, to rediscover the love that had brought them together in the first place. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, she turned to him and smiled. "Thank you," she said softly, "for giving us a second chance." He looked at her, his heart filled with a mix of emotions. "I didn't do it for you," he replied. "I did it for us. For the life we've built together, for the love we still have. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want to face it with you." She reached out and took his hand, her touch warm and familiar. "Me too," she said. "No matter what happens, we'll face it together." As they sat there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were finally moving in the right direction. Months had passed since that fateful evening when the husband found the letter. The storm of emotions that had once consumed him had slowly begun to settle, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. The journey hadn't been easy. There were days when the weight of the past felt unbearable, and nights when doubts crept in, threatening to undo the progress they had made. But through it all, they had held on, determined to rebuild what had been broken. One crisp autumn morning, the husband woke up early, as he often did these days. He slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake his wife, and made his way to the kitchen. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt peaceful rather than lonely. He brewed a pot of coffee and sat by the window, watching as the first rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. As he sipped his coffee, he found himself reflecting on the past few months. The counseling sessions had been challenging but transformative. They had learned to communicate in ways they never had before, to listen without judgment and to speak without fear. They had also learned to forgive, not just each other, but themselves. It wasn't a perfect process, and there were still moments of tension and pain, but they were moving forward, one step at a time. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. He turned to see his wife standing in the doorway, her hair tousled from sleep and a soft smile on her face. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm and familiar. "Good morning," he replied, returning her smile. "I made coffee." She poured herself a cup and joined him by the window. For a few moments, they sat in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that comes from years of shared experiences and unspoken understanding. "Do you remember the first time we watched the sunrise together?" she asked suddenly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. He chuckled softly. "How could I forget? We were on that camping trip, the one where it rained the entire time. We stayed up all night talking, and when the sun finally came out, it felt like a miracle." She laughed, the sound light and carefree. "I think that was the moment I knew I wanted to spend the rest of my life with you." He reached out and took her hand, his heart swelling with emotion. "I'm glad you did," he said quietly. "Despite everything, I'm glad we found our way back to each other." She squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Me too," she said. "I know we've been through a lot, but I think it's made us stronger. We've learned to fight for each other, to cherish what we have." He nodded, his gaze returning to the sunrise. "It's funny," he said after a moment. "I used to think that love was about never making mistakes, about being perfect. But now I see that it's about how you handle the mistakes, how you grow from them. It's about choosing each other, even when it's hard." She leaned her head on his shoulder, her presence a comforting weight. "I think you're right," she said. "And I choose you, every single day." They sat there for a long time, watching as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its golden light over the world. It felt like a new beginning, a chance to start fresh and build something even stronger than before. Later that day, they decided to take a walk through the park, something they hadn't done in years. The air was crisp and cool, the leaves crunching beneath their feet as they strolled hand in hand. They talked about years had passed since the storm that had nearly torn their marriage apart. The husband and wife now found themselves in a place they could have never imagined during those dark days, a place of peace, understanding, and deep gratitude. Their journey had not been easy, but it had been worth it. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, the husband turned to his wife and said, "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" She smiled, her eyes reflecting the golden hues of the sky. "All the time," she replied. "It's hard to believe that something so painful could lead to something so beautiful." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I used to think that what happened would define us forever. But now I see it as just one chapter in our story. A hard chapter, but one that taught us so much." Their story had indeed become a source of inspiration, not just for themselves, but for others as well. Over the years, they had shared their journey with close friends and family, and eventually, with a wider audience. They had written a book together, not to dwell on the pain but to offer hope to others who might be facing similar struggles. The book, titled Through the Storm, A Journey of Love and Forgiveness, had touched countless lives. Readers from all walks of life had reached out to thank them for their honesty and vulnerability. One letter, in particular, stood out. It was from a young couple on the brink of divorce, who had found hope in their story. "Your book saved our marriage," the letter read. "We were ready to give up, but your story reminded us that love is worth fighting for. Thank you for showing us that even the deepest wounds can heal." The husband and wife had been deeply moved by the letter. It was a reminder that their pain had not been in vain, it had become a source of light for others. As they continued to reflect on their journey, they realized that their story was about more than just infidelity and forgiveness. It was about resilience, growth, and the power of love to overcome even the darkest moments. One day, they were invited to speak at a local community center about their experience. The room was packed, filled with people of all ages who had come to hear their story. As they stood at the podium, the husband looked out at the audience and felt a surge of emotion. "Thank you for being here," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We're not here because we have all the answers. We're here because we've been through something that nearly broke us, and we want to share how we found our way back to each other." His wife stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room. "Love isn't always easy," she said. "It's messy and complicated, and sometimes it hurts. But it's also the most powerful force in the world. It can heal wounds, bridge divides, and bring light to the darkest places." They took turns sharing their story, from the moment the letter was discovered to the difficult conversations, the counseling sessions, and the slow, steady process of rebuilding trust. They spoke openly about their mistakes, their regrets, and the lessons they had learned along the way. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, the husband said. It's about choosing to move forward, even when the past still hurts. It's about recognizing that we're all human, and we all make mistakes. His wife nodded in agreement. And love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice. It's choosing to stay, even when it's hard. It's choosing to believe in each other, even when things seem hopeless. The audience listened in rapt attention, many of them wiping away tears. When the couple finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Afterward, they were approached by dozens of people, each with their own story to share. One woman, her eyes filled with tears, said, "Your story gave me hope. I've been holding on to so much anger and pain, but hearing you talk about forgiveness made me realize that I need to let go." A young man, his voice trembling, said, "I've been struggling in my marriage, and I was ready to give up. But now I see that it's worth fighting for. Thank you for reminding me of that." The husband and wife were humbled by the response. They had never imagined that their story would have such an impact, but they were grateful for the opportunity to help others. As the years went by, they continued to share their story, not just through speaking engagements and their book, but in their everyday lives. They became mentors to younger couples, offering guidance and support to those who were struggling. They also made a conscious effort to nurture their own relationship, to never take each other for granted. One of their favorite traditions was their weekly date night, where they would set aside time to reconnect and reflect on their journey. Sometimes they would go out to dinner, other times they would simply sit on the porch with a glass of wine and talk. On one such evening, as they sat under the stars, the husband turned to his wife and said, "Do you ever wonder what our lives would be like if we hadn't gone through all of that?" She thought for a moment before answering. "Sometimes," she said. "But I think we're stronger because of it. We've learned so much about each other and ourselves. And I think we appreciate what we have even more." He nodded, his heart filled with gratitude. "I think you're right. And I wouldn't trade what we have now for anything." As they sat there, hand in hand, they felt a deep sense of peace. They had been through storms, but they had weathered them together. And in the process, they had built a love that was stronger and more resilient than ever. Their story was a reminder that life is full of unexpected twists and turns, but it's also full of hope. It's a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is light. And it's a reminder that love, when nurtured and cherished, can overcome even the greatest challenges. As the years passed, their love continued to grow, a testament to the power of forgiveness, resilience, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. And as they watched their grandchildren play in the yard, they knew that their legacy was not just in the life they had built together, but in the love they had shared and the hope they had given to others.